Okay, hello everyone. This is a special video that is designed to explore some of the key ideas in W.J.T. Mitchell's piece, Representation. If you've not read the article yet, use this video as a way to orient yourself to some of the bigger ideas that we'll want to continue to think about as we get deeper into our unit. If you've already read the article, then use this as a way to review some of those key ideas, again, keeping them in mind as we move forward because they're really important. Side note, if you want to see a copy of the slideshow that we're going to be working with in this video, just as a slideshow, you can find that posted to the website pretty easily. So yeah, let's get into it. All right, so we begin by thinking about what representation even is and why people do it. This is probably not a word that we are unfamiliar with. We have experiences and we try to represent those experiences using language all the time. If you've been to a concert where your favorite musician sang a song and you had this really emotional experience, and then the next day you wanted to tell your friend about what that concert was like, you have to figure out how to quite literally represent that experience to somebody else using only words. If you've ever had some sort of religious experience, or you've had some kind of experience with a sporting event where your favorite athlete won the game at the end of the match or whatever, you have to tell somebody else what that experience was like through the process of representation. So Mitchell begins with this quote: "Man is a representational animal, the creature whose distinctive character is the creation and manipulation of signs, things that stand for or take the place of something else." And a lot of animals have consciousness, but the thing that makes human beings really unique is that we seem to be really driven to represent our experiences to ourselves and even to later generations. We go all the way back to ancient cave paintings that we find in France, or old artwork of hunts and things like that. We're all trying to represent an experience to other people. Now, there are two modes of representation that Mitchell describes. The aesthetic mode of representation, which we sometimes call the semiotic mode, and then later the political mode of representation. We're probably familiar with both of these already. The aesthetic mode is when something stands in for something else. A really easy example is in The Great Gatsby, when Fitzgerald is using the flashing green light as a way to stand in for Gatsby's yearning for the future with Daisy, or Gatsby's dream. The connection between these two things seems kind of arbitrary. We're going to get to that later. Now, the other mode of representation here is political representation. We're probably very familiar with this. We live in a representative democracy where we elect people to stand in for us, because you can't have every single person in the United States working together to create the laws. That would be far too complicated. So big groups of people elect one person to represent them, and then they keep the government going. Now, Mitchell uses the theater as a site of complex representation. He says both semiotic and political modes combine, where actors stand for other people. This is also really interesting if we think about what's going on here. I used a picture of Hamilton because Hamilton is adds several layers on top of all of that. You're seeing actors stand in for famous historical figures who were themselves elected, many of whom were elected political officials, and they are representing these other bigger, more nebulous ideas about American freedom and liberty and history and all sorts of other stuff. So that's a particularly complex mode of representation, but if you're familiar with Hamilton, then it's probably one that you may appreciate. Okay, so as the presentation moves on, as the article moves on, we get this kind of diamond-shaped diagram, and Mitchell talks about the triangular relationship. He says, one way to think of it is as a triangular relationship. Representation is always of something or someone, by something or someone, and to someone, or maybe even for someone. These basic elements of representation are things that we want to keep in mind when we're trying to use these ideas from Mitchell and apply them to a text that we see. A literary text, especially like a play. That's what we're going to be doing next week. Now, when we ask these very basic questions, these three very important questions, we can then understand, this is another point that Mitchell makes, that there could be some problems with this mode of representation. He says, axes of representation and communication. They present a barrier that cuts across, as it were, our lines of communication with others, presenting the possibility of misunderstanding, error, and downright falsehood. Now, we live in an era where we're constantly surrounded by information. Some of that information, unfortunately, is deliberately designed to mislead people or maybe persuade them using some maybe flimsy evidence. A classic example of this is the Willie Horton ad that we looked at for last week's assignment. This is an ad that is designed to be a sort of a dog whistle for a kind of a racist idea related to black men and criminality. It is a representation of a real event, but of course the way that it represents is deliberately misleading. The audience that it is designed to speak to is an audience who is interested in participating in a presidential election. So what we see here is what Mitchell describes as a misunderstanding or perhaps even an error. Depending on your opinion, it could be a downright falsehood. I think it's important to note that William Horton to this day maintains his innocence, and that's up for readers to decide themselves. So when we look at these questions about falsehood, misunderstanding, and error, we see that the stakes are very high when it comes to certain types of representation, especially when politics and ideology are both involved. Okay, so Mitchell moves on and he gives us these three really important terms: context, codes, and conventions. Basically, when he says context, he's saying context determines how representation happens. So, in other words, the green light in Gatsby represents Gatsby's dreams and desires for Daisy in the future. But once he actually gets Daisy, he says that his count of enchanted objects diminishes by 1. Nick is saying that about Gatsby. In other words, the context has changed, so the flashing green light doesn't symbolize anything anymore. It doesn't represent anything. It's just a green light. So for us as students of literary representation, the context is so important. A book that was written 100 years ago might represent all sorts of different ideas, but today it may not represent anything. Or, in the case of an example we're going to get into soon, it represents something very different from what it was originally intended to represent. So that's why context is so important. Another thing that we need to think about is codes. Codes are really a set of rules for creating a representation. I almost like to think that there's a relationship between code and genre. So Mitchell says that it's a body of rules for combining and deciphering representational signs. I think when we look at, let's say, a genre of television show like a TV sitcom, this is a 30-minute show, features all sorts of familiar elements, and when we see signs, familiar objects in those sitcoms that represent something, we say, oh yeah, that represents X. I think a really great example of that might be something like in a TV sitcom when you see somebody doing domestic labor, a character who is making their children a school lunch or washing the dishes or doing laundry or something like that, that maybe this is supposed to represent a sort of family love or family duty. And we say, oh yeah, that's right, I know what that is because it's happening within this context of this show. And then even more specifically, Mitchell talks about conventions, and that conventions are really like smaller mini codes or styles, genres that operate because of social agreement. In other words, we all can get behind this idea of a TV sitcom operating in a certain way because it follows a set of rules, and those rules are familiar to us. For example, conventions of a TV sitcom might be that it begins with a theme song. It has some familiar character types, like the kid who doesn't follow the rules, or the kid who really does follow the rules, or maybe the friendly neighbor who's always there to lend a helping hand. It happens in 30 minutes. There are 3 acts. There are 2 commercial breaks. All of these conventions work together so that we can understand what this genre represents. So we talked about context, codes, and conventions. Mitchell moves on to talk about modes of representation. Just like context, codes, and conventions, these 3 modes are terms that we want to use in a lot of our analytical work next week. So let's check those out. First, he talks about the iconic mode of representation. This is when a sign resembles by association what it represents. A classic example is the Microsoft Windows logo, that like it looks like a window and it's supposed to be the logo for the Windows operating system. Another good example is probably Apple Computer's logo, which is like a picture of an apple with maybe a little bite out of it or something. But then it gets more complex because the apple suggests an ancient story, a biblical story about Adam and Eve in the book of Genesis. And when Eve takes a bite from the tree of knowledge, she gains knowledge, but at a serious cost. So the Apple Computer logo is doing a lot of different representational work there. It's not just iconic, as Mitchell points out. Now, the symbolic is a type of representational relationship that is agreed upon, but it's arbitrary, with no resemblance to what it actually represents. I think a good example here is if you ever played the old game of Cat's Cradle when you were a kid, where you have the piece of string and you do this thing and you make different shapes. I don't know why it's called that, but we all agree that that's what it represents, even though what that is still also kind of unclear. Another really useful thing, and this is in most works of literature, if you've ever had a teacher who tells you that, you know, this one thing in this book represents X, and you're kind of like, really, why is that? Well, it's because everybody agrees that it represents X. When we read The Great Gatsby and we say that the green light represents Gatsby's yearning for the future with Daisy, like his dreams, we all agree that that's what it is, even though a green light representing dreams is kind of an arbitrary relationship. Okay, and then lastly, there is the indexical representational relationship. This is the least common of the three, but this is a type of relationship where the thing you're looking at stands in for an object that is no longer there. I think a really good example of this that Mitchell talks about is the footprint, where we know that something was there at one time, it is no longer there. It is just absent space. So at the bottom of this slide, we get this really important quote from Mitchell. This shows up on page 14. He says, "Now, it's important to realize that the long tradition of explaining literature and the other arts in terms of representation is matched by an equally long tradition of discomfort with this notion." And I think that this probably resonates with a lot of students too, because as a teacher, if I'm talking about a work of literature and what it represents, what I'm doing here is kind of taking part in this arbitrary connection that is agreed upon by other readers. But we know that context changes with time, and as context changes, so does representational relationship. So yeah, we can talk about what things represent, but we also acknowledge that this is kind of uncomfortable too. If you've ever had an English experience in a previous English class where your teacher tried to tell you what something represented, but you were like, really? I don't agree with that, then I think Mitchell would probably be on your side. The reason that you don't agree is because all of the reasons that we've talked about. Context changes. What we see as relating is really, at times, very subjective and usually determined by how a lot of people think and feel. But because those ideas are always changing, representational meaning is also in a state of flux. All right. So then we get this quote, and I think this quote is really important. I want to rest here for a little bit. "It should be clear that representation, even purely aesthetic representation of fictional persons and events, can never be completely divorced from political and ideological questions. One might argue that representation is precisely the point where these questions are most likely to enter the literary work." So have you ever been in an English class where you've asked yourself the question, like, why does everything have to be about politics? Or why does everything have to be about ideology? What Mitchell argues is that there's no beyond this context. Everything is always being read and understood, especially in terms of how it is representative, within a political context and within an ideological context. Now, this term ideology can mean a number of different things in a number of contexts. In this context, the study of literature, we're thinking about it as a taken for granted set of assumptions about how the world works. Anytime you would look at something and say, well, that's just what you do, what you're really talking about is ideology. So again, Mitchell says there is no beyond this. Everything is always being read through political and ideological lenses. And we know that because context changes over time, things can represent differently over time. And we're going to talk about an example of that in just a bit. So anyway, as we move forward, we want to think about this question of we can't really divorce a text, what it represents. We can't divorce that from the political and the ideological. This is very true of the two plays that we're going to be reading starting next week, Fences and Dutchman. All right, let's move on to the next slide. Here, Mitchell is talking to us about two very important terms, expressionism and formalism. He says expressionism is a way of thinking about a text that contains an unrepresentable essence, like God, the soul, the author's intent, etc., that is somehow manifested in the work. It doesn't represent the thing, instead, it is the thing. Now, this is a type of reading that was really popular in the 19th century, but it still remains present today in some circles. And if you've ever had like a really old school English teacher who might say something like, if they pass out a work of literature and they say, this is the soul of the author, or maybe you go and see a play by Shakespeare and somebody says, this is Shakespeare's soul manifested on stage for us. That's one perspective. It was one that was popular in the 19th century, but again, it continues on today, not as popular as other perspectives, but it remains. We also see this in certain faith traditions, religious communities, who see the books, the sacred texts of their religion as not a representation of the divine, but as the divine itself, an extension of the divine. So when we see this mode of representation, which we're going to use air quotes there because this isn't a representation, it's an extension of something else. When we see this, we refer to this as expressionism. Now, this is not to be confused with the word expressionism as it's used in maybe the fine art community to talk about an artistic movement that was popular in the late 19th century. That's something a little different. Mitchell also talks about formalism. And with formalism, he defines as a way of thinking about a text as a representation of something else. The focus is on the signifiers, like representational objects, and not so much about who made it, who the audience is, etc. Now again, this is a type of thinking that is popular in the 19th century, and it's very much a kind of thinking that still is true today. We've complicated this model now, but when we look at a text like The Great Gatsby, we don't think that this is Fitzgerald's soul that is here for us to experience. We see this and these characters as standing in for something else. And what that something else is something we get a chance to figure out as readers. Now, of course, things are more complicated today because in addition to thinking about what this represents or what this stands in for, of the text, we ask questions like, who wrote this? Who is the intended audience? Mitchell gives us this question, or this quote down here at the bottom of 16. Modernism frequently presents itself as having grown out of representational models. It is now very unfashionable to talk about literature or other arts as representations of life. This is kind of controversial. I think if you've ever had an English teacher, and I'm talking about myself here, who has made an argument for this, we know that it's kind of maybe uncomfortable for us, or maybe we just don't see it. I know in my own high school experience, I had a teacher my junior year who taught The Great Gatsby, and she said that The Great Gatsby is representative of like your actual life. Like you could grow up and be James Gatz, or you could try to be Jay Gatsby because the American dream is real. You could work really hard and be successful like Gatsby. Now, given our conversation about The Great Gatsby and how, everything that we talked about, this idea is actually kind of weird. I mean, like, I don't see Jay Gatsby as an aspirational character. Like, I don't know that we would really want to be him for a variety of ways. Just as we don't want to be Daisy, or we certainly don't want to be Tom. We don't want to be any of those characters, probably not even Nick. So to see this as a representation of real life, I think is maybe a misreading. It is certainly a representation of something, but real life, I don't think so. It's far too dreamy, too abstract, too quote-unquote romantic to be simply a representation of real life. So we see this as an example of literary modernism, a movement of which Fitzgerald was a part. So yeah, where we are right now, we don't really read literature because we think that it's a representation of real life. We read literature because it's a representation of all sorts of other stuff. And that's what we get a chance to talk about later. Quick side note, not at all saying that literature can't be a representation of real life. In fact, me personally as a reader, when I have experiences where I really connect with characters, or I say to myself, that character is just like me or just like a friend of mine, those kinds of experiences can be extremely powerful. And that's not the kind of thing that Mitchell's talking about here. So if you've had those experiences as a reader, thumbs up. I personally find them to be very powerful. But when we're talking about formalism versus expressionism, we're talking about something else. Just quick note. Okay, now what we want to do is talk about postmodern dilemmas. In this context, we could have an entire class talking about what postmodernism is, but in this context, Mitchell talks about postmodernism as often being characterized, or often characterizing an era of hyper-representation. Reality itself begins to be experienced as an endless network of representations. Categories like the thing itself, the real, and the original now become themselves representations, endlessly reduplicated and redistributed as commodities. Now, this is like a really complicated idea, but it's also fascinating. When we look at a film like, let's say, a Disney film like The Little Mermaid, we look to some of the signifiers like Ariel's wedding dress at the end, or what's the prince's name? Prince Andrew or Prince, I don't know, whatever the prince's name is. We see they have a wedding on the ship at the end. We see Ursula as this character symbolizing evil. We see King Triton as being this kind of strong fatherly figure with his pitchfork or whatever. So when we look at these images of Ariel's wedding dress and the prince's uniform, and we think that this is a representation of quote-unquote true love, we now have the opportunity to have Disney-themed weddings where we can purchase the outfits or the costumes. We can go to a place, we can hire people who will actually dress up as characters from the movie, and then you can get married as though you're a character in this movie, because by imitating this representation of true love, you can also have true love. Now, this kind of situation is a deeply strange one, and it's one that is also built on this idea of commodities, things that you can buy so that you can own whatever the original representation represented. In this case, if The Little Mermaid tells us that it represents true love, we can now buy things that are like The Little Mermaid so that we can own true love. We can buy it as a commodity. This is a strange new mode of representation that we refer to as the postmodern, and we see it in a lot of contemporary literature. Now, if you're interested in reading more about this, please let me know, because I have tons of recommendations. Mitchell begins to conclude by looking at some core questions when dealing with representational text. Now, I also have a sub-question here: what text isn't representational? I think that's really important. Like, everything is always in the process of representing something. So for us as students of representation, we can ask these foundational texts to get a better understanding of what it is we're looking at and what kind of work is happening. The first one has to do with the identity of the text itself. Do these representations appear elsewhere? When you look at a film or a TV show like Amos and Andy, there were no other shows like that on TV in the early 1950s. So the answer is not so much. Unfortunately, there were a lot of other representational texts that perpetuated racist ideas about black people in America. So if we look at this representation and we say, well, I see this elsewhere, then maybe this representation is true. This, of course, is how problematic ideas about all sorts of stuff spread around. So when we look at the identity of a text, we're asking ourselves, do these representations appear elsewhere? The next question that we want to ask is the determinancy of meaning. In other words, how exact or fixed is this meaning of the text? Another way of thinking about this is this open to interpretation, or is this like pretty clearly representing something else? When we look at a text like The Great Gatsby and we see the flashing green light representing Gatsby's dream, this seems like a pretty arbitrary connection. It seems open to interpretation. So if it is open to interpretation, then we need to tread lightly, and we have to understand, like, well, maybe it isn't just representing one thing, maybe it's multiple things. If so, how do we account for them as responsible readers? Okay, then we also have to ask ourselves about the integrity of the author. Who produced this, and how honorable are they? This word honorable is really important because it has to do with, are their intentions good? And of course, that's kind of a hard question to respond to. We might be able to look at a text like Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, a book that you probably read in Honors English 9, or maybe you read an excerpt of it. This is a pre-Civil War story by an American writer who was white, and she wrote this book about the mistreatment of enslaved people. And she did it because she felt that if she could tell the truth about the experience of enslavement, people who read it could not ever support the institution of slavery. She did it as an abolitionist agitator. She wanted to ruffle people's feathers. There is an apocryphal story, meaning a story that we all know of but we can't actually verify as true, that Harriet Beecher Stowe met Lincoln in the Oval Office of the White House. And Lincoln shook her hand and said, "So, you're the little lady who started all of this." And what he was talking about was the American Civil War. So what this text represents is something that is from an honorable perspective. She wants to abolish the institution of slavery. But this text is also from, the mid-19th century. Nowadays, when we read Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, we generally do it in a school setting, an academic setting. We see it as kind of perpetuating harmful stereotypes about certain kinds of characters. In fact, if you refer to an African American person as an Uncle Tom, this is seen as a gross insult. But in the mid-1800s, this was not the case. What the book represents is always being seen through a political and an ideological frame. So it is representing something very different for readers today in 2020 than it did when it was first published before the American Civil War. And I think that's exactly what Mitchell's talking about when he's covering this material. So Harriet Beecher Stowe's, her intentions were honorable, but that still doesn't mean that the representation of the book is fixed in time. It's always changing. Lastly, we want to look at the validity of the interpretation. How reasonable is the interpretation of what is being represented? When we look at a text where somebody says this represents X, if that's an unreasonable position, we can probably just throw that away and maybe move on and create our own interpretation of what something represents. Again, keeping in mind that all of this is changing. Of all of the things in this reading, because there's a lot to cover, what is it that we want to take home? We know that that Mitchell talks about a Robert Browning poem called My Last Duchess. This is a very famous poem. And he says, what Browning shows us is the uncontrollability of representations, the way they take on a life of their own that escapes and defies the will to determine their meaning. I think we see this in so many texts that begin as meaning one thing, but then end up meaning something totally different. Uncle Tom's Cabin is a great example. It begins as representing the experience of enslavement, the brutality, and the violence of it, but by today's standards, it is seen as something very different. We can even look at contemporary examples. I think there's a recent trend of people wearing heavy metal t-shirts from like metal bands of the 80s as sort of like high fashion accessories. That's for me, that's a thing that I find deeply confusing, because it was never like that. You would always just wear those things around to advertise your favorite band, but now you have people who wear them as these like extremely expensive fashion accessories. What it represents is something totally different from what it represented 30 years ago. Mitchell also says Browning's poem shows us an interest in escape from representation, but why such an escape can never succeed. Everything is always representing. Nothing can stop representing. So when you have a literary text produced by a writer, it's always going to be representing something, whether that writer likes it or not. And that writer is not in control of what it represents. Readers are in control of what that represents. And as we've seen in other texts, things can go off the rails pretty quickly. The final point here I think is really important. He says, no representation without taxation. In other words, every representation exacts a cost in the form of a gap between intention and realization, between the original and the copy. Sometimes the tax is so slight we don't even notice, but sometimes it's as ample as the gap between life and death. Now, when the stakes are really high, especially in the case of the Willie Horton political advertisement, the tax that you have to pay as a politician to convince an entire nation that this sort of thing is true, that African American men like William Horton are a threat to you, and that you need to support policies that get tough on crime, that increase mass incarceration, that break up whole communities, and that imprison lots and lots of African American men. The price that you have to pay, in my opinion, is enormous for this kind of representation. But I think maybe on a lighter note, when we look at an experience that we've had, if you've seen your favorite musician sing a song that brought you to tears, and you have to represent that experience to your friend, you're never going to get it right, because that's impossible. You're going to do your best, but there's going to be a gap between what you actually experienced and what you're trying to represent to somebody else. That gap, Mitchell refers to as a tax, a cost that you have to pay, because you're never going to be able to represent the real to an audience. So if we have like a lighter experience, like something that we experienced ourselves, a sporting event, maybe a religious experience, maybe a concert experience from our favorite artist, or maybe just an experience we had at the dinner table, then we're always going to be trying to represent that through language, but sometimes we'll fail. We're always going to fail. We're never going to be able to get it right, exactly right. But when the representation is much wider, when it deals with really big issues about race, class, gender, the stakes are much higher, and we have an obligation as authors and as readers to try and get it as right as we can. That's why we have these core questions that Mitchell urges us to ask. So if you want to test out your own ability to apply this, this is the final exercise. What you're being asked to do here is to look at a text from Saturday Night Live called Black Jeopardy. This is a parody of the actual Jeopardy show. This particular episode, because this was a running sketch, there are several versions. They're all, I think, pretty interesting and pretty fruitful for discussion. But this particular episode came out after the movie Black Panther was released, and it poses the question, what if the character in the film were actually a contestant on the show Black Jeopardy? What I'd like you to do is watch this episode and then respond to these questions. You can just do this in your mind, but you want to keep some things in mind. In what way is this an example of autoethnography, what Pratt refers to as autoethnography? We also want to think about what sort of potential problems emerge when we think of this text from an expressionist perspective. In other words, if this is representative, or if this is not a representation, it's just an extension of blackness. This is blackness in America. What sort of problems might occur if we were to approach this from the expressionist perspective? How does the sketch work to represent what we might think of as black culture? And how does it also work to represent white culture? This is especially true at the end, where the T'Challa character talks about Karen putting raisins in her potato salad, which I think is especially funny. But yeah, we want to respond to this question. How does it represent white culture versus black culture in America? And then lastly, what are the noticeable signifiers, the character traits? And what kinds of tax, or what kind of tax must be paid for such a representation as this? Anyway, we look at this text because, just like all the other texts around us, it's always in the process of representing something. By using these terms, using these ideas, using these core questions, we become more astute readers of culture, and we are able to more articulately describe what a text is representing. Not just a Saturday Night Live sketch, but even something as complex as a feature-length play, which is really the subject of next week's work. If you're still watching this, I thank you for watching this entire thing. I know this is a lot of work, but Mitchell's article I think is so important for us because it gives us a language to talk about how texts do their representative work. So I look forward to reading all of your work in the future. Hopefully you're able to use some of these ideas, use this terminology to better articulate your thinking. And again, I thank you for staying with us until the end. So we'll see you in the next one. Until then, be good to yourself, be good to each other. See ya.